The morning my daughter signed papers to remove me from my own home, I was in the kitchen making tea. Not because I didn't know what was happening, I knew exactly what was happening. I had known for 6 months. I put the kettle on anyway, set out 3 cups, and waited for the sound of the front door. I heard it at 9:47 a.m. Melissa walked in first. She always walked in first now, ahead of my daughter, ahead of everyone, like she had already decided she owned the room. My daughter June followed 2 steps behind with a folder tucked under her arm, and the particular kind of careful expression she wore when she was about to do something she knew was wrong but had already convinced herself was right. I poured the tea. I offered them both a seat. And when Melissa slid the papers across my own kitchen table and explained, very warmly, very reasonably, that this was simply the most practical solution given everything, I looked at my daughter and I asked her one question. Is this what you actually want, June? Is this coming from you? June looked at Melissa. She didn't answer. I already had my answer. What neither of them knew, sitting at that table in my kitchen, in the house where June had learned to walk and lost her first tooth, and come home crying from her first heartbreak, was that I had spent the previous 6 months building something they would never see coming. I had done it quietly, methodically, in the hours between when they assumed I was watching television and going to bed early. The way women my age are assumed to do. I am not the kind of woman who goes to bed early. My name is Frances, and before I tell you what I did, I need you to understand who I was before any of this started. I was not the dramatic type. I had never been. I raised my daughter on a teacher's salary in Barrie, Ontario, after her father, my ex-husband Dale, left when June was 9 years old. I did not fall apart when Dale left. I made a schedule. I found a second job tutoring on weekends, and I kept the house. Not because anyone told me to. Because it was mine. I had signed for it, I had scraped for the down payment, and I was not going to let the end of a marriage be the end of everything else. That house had 3 bedrooms, a narrow backyard, and a maple tree in the front that turned a color every October, that still makes me stop when I see it. I paid it off 11 years ago. Fully. No mortgage. The deed in my name alone because Dale and I had separated before he'd contributed a single payment, and the courts agreed. I kept that house the way some people keep a promise. I retired from teaching 4 years ago. My pension from the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan was modest but steady. And I had spent 31 years contributing to it with the seriousness of someone who understood that no one else was going to do it for her. I didn't have enormous savings. I had enough. I had the house, the pension, a small TFSA, and a life I had built carefully from the rubble of my 30s. I was not a woman who needed to be taken care of. I want you to understand that, because what happened next only makes sense if you understand that first. June had always been close to me. Through high school, through university in Kingston, through the long years of her 20s when she was figuring herself out. We talked twice a week. She called me from the parking lot of the grocery store to tell me about her day. She drove up from Toronto for Thanksgiving and complained about the drive and then stayed an extra day every single time. And then she met Melissa. I want to be careful here. I am not telling you Melissa was evil. I don't think people are that simple. What I am telling you is what I observed. What I observed was a woman who was very good at being charming to the people she needed and very different in the moments she believed no one important was watching. The first time June brought Melissa to the house for dinner, I noticed 3 things. Melissa did not ask a single question about June's childhood. Melissa complimented the house twice in the first 20 minutes, but both compliments were about the square footage and the lot size, not about anything that had happened in it. And when June went to the bathroom, Melissa looked at me across the table with a smile that stayed perfectly in place and said, "You must be so proud of June. She's come so far from all of this." All of this. I refilled her wine glass and said, "She has." I kept watching. It happened slowly, the way these things do. June called less often. When she did call, there was a new vocabulary. Melissa feels that. Melissa thinks it would be better if. Melissa mentioned that maybe the reason you and I have friction is because. I recognized each sentence the moment it arrived, the way you recognize a weather pattern you've seen before. I did not push back. I listened. I kept my voice level and my responses short, and I stored everything. The engagement happened. I found out through an Instagram post, a photograph of their hands and a ring. June texted me 20 minutes later. Not called. Texted. She said she hoped I was happy for them. I wrote back that I was because in that moment I still was. I still believed June was in there somewhere, underneath whatever was happening to her. The first hint of something larger came 3 months after the engagement. June called me on a Tuesday evening, and the conversation had a shape to it that felt rehearsed. She talked about the cost of housing in Toronto. She talked about how they were thinking about starting a family. She mentioned very gently that my house was really quite large for just one person, and that the Barrie real estate market was actually doing quite well right now. I said, "It is." She said, "Mom, have you ever thought about downsizing?" I said, "I've never found a reason to." There was a pause. Then she said Melissa thought it might actually be easier for me, at my age, to be in a condo with less maintenance. I am 61 years old. I shovel my own driveway. I plant a garden every spring. But I said, "I'll give it some thought," and I let the conversation end. Then they showed up with the folder. I want to describe what was in that folder, because I think it matters. Melissa had done her homework. She had prepared a market valuation of my property, printed from an online real estate estimate, and a typed proposal laying out how they would ensure I was comfortable through an arrangement by which I would sizen the house over to them, at which point they would rent me a 2-bedroom apartment in Barrie and cover the cost for 2 years. After 2 years, I would be expected to manage independently. There was language in the document about how this was in the spirit of family, and how it would give June and Melissa a foundation to build their lives. I had given 31 years of my life to giving June a foundation, but I sat at that table and I poured the tea, and I looked at the papers. And I asked June if this was what she wanted, and she looked at Melissa instead of at me. When I walked them to the door and said I needed time to think, I was already thinking. I was thinking about a name I had written down 3 weeks earlier, after a conversation with my neighbor Ruth, who had been through something similar when her brother tried to contest their mother's estate. Ruth had mentioned a woman named her family lawyer, and then specifically, a name. A colleague of hers, someone Ruth said was thorough and did not flinch. Her name was Helen Ashworth, and she practiced family and estate law in Barrie. I called her the morning after June and Melissa's visit. Helen Ashworth was exactly what Ruth had described. She spoke in the careful, even tone of someone who had heard many variations of this particular story and had learned not to be surprised by any of them. She asked me questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. She reviewed the document Melissa had prepared, and she told me it was not binding and I had signed nothing. She also told me that the language in it, specifically the phrases about family estate planning and future asset transfer, suggested someone had done some research into what might hold up versus what might not. She told me to document everything going forward. I told her I already had been. What I had not told Helen, what I had not told anyone, was that I had already begun doing something else entirely. 3 weeks before June and Melissa came with their folder, I had visited my own financial advisor, a calm and methodical man named Bruce, at the credit union where I had banked for 22 years. I had reviewed every account, every document, every beneficiary designation. I updated my will. I restructured the title on the house under a specific legal arrangement that Helen later confirmed was exactly correct. And I began a very quiet, very organized file. The file had sections. The first section contained documentation of the original deed to my house, the full mortgage payment history showing my name exclusively, and the property tax records for the past 15 years. 11 years of those records showed the mortgage as paid in full. The second section was newer. It contained printed screenshots of June's Instagram posts from the past 8 months, in which Melissa appeared in increasingly central positions, and I appeared in none. It contained a printed record of our phone call logs showing the gradual decrease in frequency. It contained notes, dated and time-stamped, of specific things said to me in conversations, including the kitchen table visit. I want to be clear, I did not do this out of anger. I did it because I had watched what happened to Ruth's family, and to my colleague Barbara's mother, and to 2 women from my former book club, and I understood what was happening. I understood that what looks like a family disagreement often has a shape underneath it, a legal and financial shape, and that the people who lose are almost always the ones who assumed love would be enough to protect them. Love is not a legal document. I also began doing my own research. Careful research. The kind that takes patience, I am a retired teacher. I know how to find information. I know how to cross-reference sources. I know how to read a document and understand what it is actually saying underneath what it appears to be saying. What I found took several weeks. Melissa had been in a previous long-term relationship, a serious one, with a woman named Carol in British Columbia. That relationship had ended 3 years ago. In the public record of the BC Supreme Court, there was a filed civil claim relating to a property dispute. The case had been settled out of court, and the settlement was sealed. What was not sealed was the original filing, which described a dispute over a jointly occupied home that one party alleged had been transferred under duress. I am not in the business of judging anyone's people have complicated histories. But I noted it. I noted it carefully and I passed it to Helen Ashworth, who noted it even more carefully than I had. I also discovered that Melissa had, in the months following their engagement, added June as a co-signer on a line of credit. The line of credit had been drawn down significantly. I only discovered this because June, during one of our shorter phone calls, mentioned offhandedly that they had some joint financing she couldn't really talk about. I asked Helen about this. Helen explained that depending on the structure, this could create implications for June's credit and financial standing if the relationship were to change. June did not know I knew any of this. Melissa certainly didn't. The wedding was scheduled for a Saturday in early September, at a vineyard venue in Prince Edward County, the kind of place that costs more per hour than I used to make in a week. I was not invited to the planning process. I was told, through a text from June sent on a Tuesday evening, that I was on the guest list and would receive a formal invitation. The formal invitation never came. 2 weeks before the wedding, I received a phone call from June. She sounded strained, like someone reading from notes. She said that she and Melissa had decided the ceremony would be intimate, and they were limiting the guest list to immediate family and close friends. She said that given the tension between me and Melissa, they felt it would be better if I didn't attend. I asked her what tension she meant specifically. She said Melissa felt I had never truly supported their relationship. I had attended their engagement dinner, I had sent a card and a gift. I had called June on Melissa's birthday because June mentioned she hoped people would reach out. But I didn't say any of this. I said, "I understand. Thank you for letting me know." Then I ended the call, and I finished what I had started. Helen Ashworth had, by this point, prepared a full legal summary of my property situation, including a formal opinion letter stating clearly and in unambiguous language that the deed was mine, the title was mine, and no verbal or informal arrangement could transfer it without my willing signature on a witnessed legal document. She had also reviewed the document Melissa had prepared and written a detailed memo on exactly why it would not have held up in any Ontario court. My financial advisor Bruce had provided a full written accounting of my pension, my TFSA, and my estate designations. Everything was documented. Everything was in order. What I sent to June's phone at 2:14 p.m. on the day of the wedding, while the guests were arriving at the vineyard in Prince Edward County, was not a threat. I want to be very clear about that. I do not send threats. I am a 61-year-old retired schoolteacher from Barrie, Ontario, and I do not send threats. What I sent was a PDF. It had 4 parts. The first was Helen Ashworth's formal opinion letter regarding the property. The second was a summary of the BC civil filing from Melissa's previous relationship, with the relevant sections highlighted. The third was a note from Bruce confirming the current status of the line of credit June had co-signed, along with a brief explanation of what that meant for her individual credit rating if the debt was not serviced. The fourth was a single paragraph I had written myself. It said, "I am not sending this to hurt you. I am sending this because I love you and I need you to have information you don't currently have. Whatever you decide to do with it is yours to decide. I am your mother and I will answer my phone." Then I went into my backyard and I sat in the garden chair I had set out every May for the past 20 years and I drank a cup of tea, and I waited. June called me at 4:38 p.m. She was not crying when she called, she was something quieter than crying. She said my name twice before she said anything else. Then she said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Long enough to be sure." She said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" And this is the part I have thought about the most since then. Because the honest answer is complicated, and I wanted to give her the honest answer. I said, Because I needed you to be in a position where you could hear it. Not when you were in love and new and certain. You would have protected her. You would have defended her. And I would have lost you faster than I was already losing you. There was a long silence on the line. June said, "The wedding didn't happen." I didn't say anything. She said, "She left during the cocktail hour. She took her car and she didn't come back." Later, I learned from June, piece by piece over many conversations, what had actually happened when she received the PDF. She had stepped away from her guests to read it. She had found Melissa and asked her directly about the BC filing. Melissa's response, according to June, was to tell her the filing was a misunderstanding, and that I was trying to ruin the happiest day of her life. That this was exactly the kind of thing she'd been talking about, that her mother had always done this. June told me she looked at Melissa in that moment and thought, "I don't know you." That was the moment, not the document. The response to the document. Melissa left. Her family left shortly after, quietly, in the particular kind of silence that descends when everyone in a room knows something has gone wrong, but no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. June stood in the vineyard in her dress with 200 guests looking at her, and she made a short, calm announcement that the ceremony would not be proceeding. And she thanked everyone for coming. She told me later that making that announcement was the hardest thing she had ever done. And also that the moment she said the words out loud, something in her chest that had been held tight for a very long time finally released. I drove to Prince Edward County that evening. 4 hours. June was still at the venue when I arrived, sitting alone at one of the outdoor tables with her shoes off and a glass of water in front of her. She looked at me when I came across the grass and she said, very quietly, "You drove 4 hours." I said, "Of course I did." We sat at that table until well after dark. The venue staff moved quietly around us, clearing things, and no one asked us to leave. June talked and I listened. She told me how it had started. The slow way Melissa had introduced doubts about me. The things she had said in private that seemed reasonable at the time. The way June had found herself defending Melissa's version of events even when some part of her knew the events weren't quite right, she said. "I kept thinking you were the problem." She was very good at making me think that. I said, "I know," she said. "Why aren't you angry at me?" I said, "I'm your mother. Being angry at you for being manipulated is like being angry at someone for getting sick." She was quiet for a long time after that. The months that followed were not easy. Melissa retained a lawyer and made a claim against the line of credit arrangement, attempting to position it as a jointly funded asset. Helen Ashworth was thorough enough that the claim was addressed without significant litigation. The settlement, such as it was, cost June some money she didn't have. But it was contained. Helen had made sure of that. June spent several months working through what had happened. She found a therapist, a woman in Toronto. She saw every week for the first year. She called me more often than she had in years, but not every day. We are not those kinds of people. We talked on Tuesday evenings, like we used to, and sometimes on Sunday mornings if she was driving somewhere. She came up to Barrie for Thanksgiving. She complained about the 400. She stayed an extra day. I planted the garden in the spring like I always do. June came up one weekend in April and helped me with the beds along the back fence, the ones that need the most work after winter. She has always been good with her hands, June. I had forgotten that. Or maybe I hadn't been able to see it clearly for a while. In the fall we had a conversation about the house. Not the kind of conversation Melissa had prepared a folder for. The quiet kind, over coffee. June said she wanted me to know that she never wanted this house. She said Melissa had framed it as something June should want, something they deserved. And June had let herself believe it, because she had wanted to be the kind of person who built something alongside a partner. I told her she would still be that person. She would build something. Just not that way, and not with that person, she said. "Mom, what did Dad's lawyer leave you in that envelope? The one from after he left?" This was something I had not thought about in years. When Dale left, his lawyer had sent a formal letter. I had read it once, standing in the kitchen, and then I had put it in the filing cabinet in the spare room and not opened it since. It contained his acknowledgement that the house was mine and a release of any future claim on it. He had signed it. I got up and found the letter. I handed it to June. She read it silently. Then she said, "He did one good thing." I said, "He did." We sat with that for a while. I am not going to tell you I handled everything perfectly. I didn't. There were months when I should have spoken up and didn't, when I chose the quiet life over the necessary conversation because I was afraid of losing June faster. There were times I confused keeping the peace with actually having peace, and those are not the same thing. I know that now better than I did. But here is what I also know. Being quiet does not mean being passive. Watching does not mean accepting. And the work you do in the spaces where no one is looking, the files you build, the lawyers you call, the documents you prepare at 11 o'clock at night at the kitchen table while the rest of the world assumes you have already given up. That work is real. It counts. It lands. Melissa looked at me and saw a 61-year-old woman alone in a house in Barrie, Ontario, who could be moved aside. She saw someone whose usefulness was finished, whose presence was an inconvenience, whose quiet was the same thing as weakness. She saw the wrong thing entirely. If you are a mother watching someone slowly redirect your child away from you, I am not going to tell you there is one right way to handle it. Every family is its own particular shape. Every situation has its own edges. But I will tell you this. Do not spend your energy trying to convince your child of your worth in the middle of the storm. That is not when they can hear it. What you can do is make sure, with everything you have, that the truth is documented, protected, and ready. That when the moment comes, and in my experience the moment does come, you are not scrambling. You are already there. You already sent the PDF, and so I want to leave you with the question that I have turned over in my mind many times since that September afternoon. It is not a comfortable question, but I think it is an important one. How many people in your life right now are being slowly convinced of a version of you that's not true? And what would it take? Not for you to prove it, but for them to finally see it for themselves. Think about that. And if any part of this story felt familiar, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. This is Lyra Payback. We will see you in the next one.